The world was made of dust and distance. For weeks, that was all Ilara had known. The Wyoming territory unfurled before her wagon like a bolt of scorched, dun-colored cloth, stretching to a horizon that never seemed to get any closer. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth, on the canvas top of her wagon, on the weary bones of her old mule. It bleached the life from everything, leaving behind the pale skeletons of sagebrush and the ghostly white of alkali flats. Far to the west, the mountains stood like a row of broken teeth, sharp and purple against a sky so vast and empty it felt like God's own loneliness. There were moments the land's raw beauty caught in her throat, a painful ache of wonder. A sunrise could paint the plains in strokes of rose and gold, and the sheer scale of the sky could feel like a kind of freedom, a space big enough to swallow a person's past whole. But mostly, it felt like an accusation. The land was stark, magnificent, and utterly indifferent. It did not care for the sweat on her brow, the fear in her heart, or the shame that clung to her like a second skin. It simply was. And she was a small, fragile thing crawling across its face, looking for a place to disappear. Her own soul felt like this landscape, scoured clean, exposed to the elements, and hollowed out by a sorrow too wide to cross. Redemption. Gulch was not a town so much as a scar on the land. It was a raw collection of unpainted timber buildings clinging to a single, wide dirt street, looking as though it had been clawed from the prairie by a desperate hand. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a handful of other structures stood hunched against the wind, their false fronts giving them an air of ambition they did not deserve. Dust, the fine, persistent dust of the plains, coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the buildings and puffing up in pale clouds with every footstep, every turn of a wagon wheel. Ilara guided her mule to a halt near the public trough, her movements slow and deliberate. She kept her head down, her sunbonnet casting a deep shadow over her face. Her dress was a plain, serviceable gray calico, faded from the sun and mended in more than one place. She had braided her brown hair so tightly it pulled at her scalp, a small, constant pain to keep her anchored in the present. She had done everything she could to make herself invisible, to become a woman no one would look at twice. It did not work. As she climbed down from the wagon, the seat of her dress catching for a moment on a splintered board, she could feel the eyes on her. The town stopped its quiet hum and turned to watch. From the shaded porch of the general store, women paused their conversation, their fans ceasing their gentle flutter. They took in her worn-out wagon, the weary mule, her solitary state. Their eyes were hard little stones of appraisal, and she could almost hear the whispers taking flight, passed from one to another behind cupped hands. A woman alone, no people, no history. Men were different. A group of them loafing outside the saloon stopped their whittling and spitting. Their gazes were heavier, slower. They traveled over her form with an insolence that made her skin crawl, a look that was a foul mixture of pity for her apparent misfortune and a crude, predatory speculation. She felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a chicken coop, an object of immediate and unwelcome interest. She kept her eyes fixed on the worn leather of her boots, focusing on the simple task of unhitching the mule, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency that belied the tremor deep inside her. All she wanted was a quiet corner of the world, a way to earn her bread that did not require her to speak of the past or look anyone in the eye. But here, in this small, harsh place, solitude was a curiosity and anonymity was a sin. Far from the prying eyes of Redemption Gulch, Caleb Blackwood worked his fence line. The ranch was a sprawling piece of land, bordered by a line of cottonwoods that traced the winding path of a shallow creek. It was a good piece of land, with enough water and grass to sustain his herd, but it was a quiet piece of land. The silence was the first thing a visitor would notice. It was not the peaceful silence of an empty church, but the heavy, profound silence of a house where a clock has stopped ticking. It was the sound of loss, and it had been Caleb's only constant companion for 5 long years. His movements were economical, stripped of all wasted motion. He pulled the wire taut with a grunt, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his sweat-stained shirt. His face, weathered by 1,000 suns, was a mask of grim concentration. Sorrow had carved deep lines at the corners of his eyes and mouth, and his gaze was that of a man who looked at the world from a great distance. He drove a staple into the post with 2 clean, powerful strikes of his hammer, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness. Thwack, thwack. The work was a penance and a prayer. It was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. He straightened up, wiping a forearm across his brow, and his eyes drifted, as they always did, to the small rise just beyond the cabin. 2 wooden markers stood there, side by side, under the shade of a lone, stubborn oak tree. Sarah, Daniel. The names were burned into his mind, more real than the fence post in his hand. He could still remember the fever, the uselessness of the cool rags, the terrifying quickness of it all. He had begged, he had bargained with a God he no longer believed in, and he had been answered with this crushing silence. He had built this ranch for them, a future of calloused hands and shared sunsets. Now, he just maintained it. He existed. He worked from sunup to sundown because if he stopped, if he allowed himself to be still for even a moment, the weight of what he had lost would press him right into the ground. The doors of Redemption Gulch closed to Alara with a quiet, polite firmness that was more cruel than a shout. At the Mercantile, she asked if they needed help stocking shelves. Mr. Gable, a man with a perpetually worried expression, just shook his head. Not at present, miss. Times are tight. At the boarding house, she inquired about work in the kitchen or laundry. The proprietor sized her up and down, her lips a thin, disapproving line. We have all the help we need. She even tried the saloon, hating every second she spent in the stale air that smelled of beer and regret, asking the bartender if he needed someone to scrub floors. He just laughed, a short, ugly sound. Not your kind of work, lady. Behind it all, she could feel the unseen hand of Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed moral compass. She had seen the woman speaking to the boarding house proprietor just after Alara had left. She was the wife of the general store owner, a woman whose pronouncements carried the weight of scripture in this small community. Alara could imagine the words, spoken with a sigh of Christian concern. A woman with no people and no history, a dangerous thing, best to keep one's distance. Her meager savings, a handful of coins tied in a kerchief, dwindled with alarming speed, a sack of oats for the mule, a loaf of stale bread and a wedge of cheese for herself. The coins felt slick and small in her palm, each one that she spent a step closer to utter ruin. Desperation began to gnaw at the edges of her composure, a cold, sickening dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. The final defeat came in the dusty, cluttered office of the town's assayer, a man who also dealt in valuables when the mood struck him. She untied the worn velvet pouch she kept pinned inside her dress. Her fingers, rough and calloused from the rains, trembled as she unwrapped the small gold locket. It was oval, with a delicate tracery of vines etched onto its surface. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, faded with time, her mother, her smile soft and kind, and her father, his eyes proud and clear. It was the last piece of her old life, the life before. It was the last tangible proof that she had once been someone's daughter, that she had once been loved. She laid it on the man's desk. He picked it up, his thumbnail scraping callously against her mother's face as he tested the gold. He weighed it in his palm, his eyes shrewd and dismissive. "It is not much," he said, his voice flat. He named a price that was an insult, a fraction of its worth. Alara felt the protest die in her throat. She had no power to bargain. Her hunger and her fear were plain on her face, and he knew it. She nodded, a single jerky motion. The act of taking his money felt like a betrayal, a final, soul-crushing surrender. She walked out of his office with coins in her pocket and a gaping hole in her chest where her last memory had been. She was truly adrift now, a ghost with no anchor to the past. That evening, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange electric tension. Then the storm broke. It did not arrive with a gentle warning of rain. It tore across the plains with the fury of a rampaging beast. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a physical force, bending the tall grasses flat and ripping at the canvas of Ilara's wagon. She had been forced to make camp a mile out of town, having been told there were no rooms at the boarding house and no space in the livery for her mule. Then came the rain. It was not a drizzle, but a solid, vertical wall of water, a deluge that turned the dusty road into a river of churning mud in minutes. Lightning cracked the sky in half, followed by peals of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The mule brayed in terror, and Ilara fought to keep the panicked animal calm, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She tried to guide the wagon toward a small stand of trees, hoping for some meager shelter, when the world lurched violently. A sickening crack echoed even over the roar of the storm. The right rear wheel splintered, sinking deep into a muddy ditch at the side of the road. The wagon tilted at a dangerous angle, its contents shifting with a groan. It was over. Stranded. Soaked to the bone, her thin dress clinging to her like a shroud. Ilara stood in the downpour, the rain plastering her hair to her face. The cold was a living thing, seeping into her marrow. She looked at the broken wagon, the last barrier between her and complete destitution, and something inside her finally broke too. Despair, a wave as powerful and relentless as the storm, washed over her. She could not go forward. She could not go back. There was nothing. She closed her eyes, ready to simply let the rain and the cold take her, to surrender to the vast, pitiless indifference of the world. Caleb had been in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal, when the storm hit. He had seen storms like this before, storms that could kill a man caught out in the open. As the wind howled around the sturdy timbers of his barn, he thought of his cattle, huddled and miserable out on the range. There was little he could do for them now, but a nagging unease pulled at him. He pulled on a heavy oilskin slicker, grabbed a lantern, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. He was making his way along the fence line that bordered the road, the lantern light a small, swimming circle in the blinding rain, when he saw it, a shape, darker than the surrounding darkness, a crippled wagon, tilted into the ditch, and a figure, standing beside it, as still as a statue. His first instinct was to turn back. Trouble. That was all a stranger brought. He had enough ghosts in his life. He had no room for the complications of the living. He was a man who craved solitude, who had walled himself off from the world for a reason. But he kept walking. He could not, in good conscience, leave anyone out in this, not even a stranger. As he drew closer, the lantern light fell upon her. A woman, drenched and trembling, her face pale and empty in the flickering glow. She did not seem to see him at first, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the roaring darkness. He stopped a few feet away, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "You cannot stay out here," he said. His voice was a low, rusty sound, rough from disuse. The sound of his voice startled her. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a wild, animal fear. She saw the tall, broad shape of a man emerging from the rain, his face hidden in the shadows cast by his hat and the lantern. Her entire body went rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted in the mud. She expected a command, an accusation, a threat. Rejection was the only currency she traded in anymore. Caleb saw the terror in her eyes. He saw she was not a threat, not some grifter looking for a handout. He saw a person who had reached the absolute end of her rope. He saw the deep, shuddering tremors that shook her frame and knew she was half frozen. The decent man he had been long ago. The man Sarah had loved, stirred somewhere deep inside him. He sighed, a sound lost in the wind. "The wagon's done for tonight," he said, his tone flat, matter-of-fact. "You can take shelter in my barn, until the storm passes." It was not a warm invitation, But it was not a dismissal either. He did not wait for her answer. He turned and walked toward the faint light of his own property, assuming she would follow. For a long moment, Ilara remained frozen, mistrust warring with the desperate, primal need for shelter. But the cold was a blade in her bones, and his back, retreating into the storm, was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. With a final broken sob, she stumbled after the light. The barn smelled of rain and hay and the warm, earthy scent of animals. It was a haven from the violence of the storm. The wind still shrieked outside, but here, in the dry, dim interior, it was a distant threat. Caleb pointed to an empty stall filled with clean straw. "There," he said, and that was all. He left the lantern on a hook, its gentle light pushing back the deepest of the shadows, and then he was gone, melting back into the rain and heading for the small cabin a short distance away. Ilara sank down into the straw, pulling a coarse horse blanket around her trembling shoulders. The rough wool scratched her skin, but it was dry. She huddled there, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, feeling the last of her strength drain away. She was safe, for the moment, but the reprieve felt temporary, fragile. A few minutes later, the barn door creaked open again. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the stormy dark. He carried a tin plate and a steaming mug. He did not enter her stall or try to speak to her. He simply walked over to a wooden crate, placed the items on it, and turned to leave. He paused at the door for a fraction of a second, his back to her. "Eat," he said, his voice still rough, before pulling the door shut behind him, leaving her alone once more. She stared at the plate. It held a thick, savory stew with chunks of beef and potato, the steam rising from it in a fragrant cloud. Beside it, the mug of coffee was black and strong. It was a simple, unspoken act of kindness, an offering with no questions asked and nothing demanded in return. It had been so long, so very long, since anyone had offered her anything without wanting something back. A strange, painful pressure built behind her eyes. She picked up the plate, her fingers so cold they could barely hold the warm tin. She ate ravenously, the hot stew chasing the chill from her body, warming her from the inside out. When she was done, she wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, letting its heat seep into her palms. Through a small, grimy window in the barn wall, she could see a single point of light in the vast, stormy darkness. It was the lamp in his cabin window, a lone beacon against the immense, churning black of the plains. She watched that light, proof that she was not entirely alone in the world, and the tears she had held back for so long finally came. They slipped down her cheeks silently, dripping onto the rough wool of the blanket. She was not weeping from sorrow, not from fear or self-pity. She was weeping for the confusing, painful flicker of gratitude that had just cracked through the thick ice of her despair, a tiny, impossible seed of hope planted in the ruins of her life. The world was born new in the morning. The storm had passed, dragging the dust and the oppressive heat with it, leaving behind a landscape washed clean and shining. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage. Droplets of water clung to every blade of grass, glittering like tiny diamonds in the early sun. Ilara emerged from the barn into this scrubbed world, feeling as raw and exposed as the damp ground beneath her feet. Caleb was already by the wagon, his broad back to her as he surveyed the damage. He squatted down, his long fingers probing the splintered wood and twisted metal. He said nothing for a long time. The only sounds the cheerful chirping of a meadowlark and the gentle gurgle of the swollen creek. Ilara stood a respectful distance away, twisting her hands in the folds of her still damp skirt, waiting for the verdict she already knew. "The axle is snapped clean," he finally said, his voice as flat and matter-of-fact as the plains themselves. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It is a bad break. It will take a forge to fix it, and time." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unreadable. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment he would tell her to go, to take her troubles elsewhere. She had been a burden for a night. She could not expect more. She braced herself for the dismissal, her shoulders tightening. But the words did not come. He just looked at her, his eyes taking in her worn dress, her thinness, the palpable anxiety radiating from her. He saw a woman with nowhere to go and no means to get there. His jaw worked for a moment, as if he were chewing on the words he did not want to say. "I reckon you can stay in the barn," he said at last, his gaze shifting to a point somewhere over her shoulder. "You can work for your keep, and for the repairs." It was not an offer of charity, it was a transaction, a plain statement of terms, and for that, she was profoundly grateful. Relief washed through her so intensely it left her weak in the knees. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He gave a short, sharp nod, as if to ward off any further expression of gratitude, and turned away. "There is water to be hauled from the creek, firewood to be chopped. The cabin needs seeing to." With that, he strode toward the corral, his long legs eating up the ground, leaving her to absorb the terms of their new, unspoken arrangement. She would work, she would earn her place, and for now, she would be safe. Ilara's work began in silence and solitude. She was a tireless, meticulous presence, moving about the ranch with a quiet efficiency that seemed intended to erase her own footsteps. Her first task was the cabin. It was a man's space, clean enough in a functional way, but utterly neglected. It smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and a deep, settled dust that spoke of long-held grief. She started by throwing open the 2 windows, letting the clean morning air and the bright sunlight flood the dim interior. She swept the floors until the pine boards shone, beat the dust from the rag rugs until her arms ached, and scrubbed the small kitchen area until the iron sink gleamed. She worked with a focused intensity, a desperation to prove her worth, to make herself useful beyond question. As she cleaned, she unearthed the artifacts of a life that had been abruptly frozen in time. On a high shelf, tucked behind a stack of almanacs, she found a small wooden horse, its lines simple and loving, its surface worn smooth by a child's hands. A pang of sorrow, sharp and unexpected, went through her. She held it for a moment, feeling the phantom weight of a little boy's imagination, before gently placing it back in its dusty hiding spot. In a large wooden chest at the foot of Caleb's bed, beneath several folded wool blankets, she found a dress. It was made of blue calico, printed with tiny yellow flowers. The fabric was faded, softened by countless washings, and it still held the faint, ghostly scent of lavender. This must have been Sarah's. Ilara carefully refolded it along its original creases, her touch as reverent as if she were handling a sacred relic. She was not a usurper here. She was a ghost, tending to the possessions of other ghosts. She felt a profound sense of respect for the woman who had once filled this silent house with her presence, for the love that had been lived within these walls. Caleb observed her from a distance. He would be mending tack in the barn or shoeing a horse in the corral, and he would see her through the open cabin door, a fleeting shape moving back and forth. He saw the way she worked, never stopping, never complaining. He also saw the things she tried to hide. He saw the way she would flinch and draw into herself if he rounded a corner too quickly, a reflexive, deer-like panic in her eyes. He noticed that she never met his gaze directly, her eyes always fixed on the ground, on her hands, on some point in the middle distance. She was a woman who had learned that the attention of men was a dangerous thing. Yet, he also saw her strength. It was not a loud or defiant strength, but a quiet, persistent resilience, like a wildflower pushing its way up through a crack in a rock. One afternoon, he watched from the porch as she turned her attention to the small, square patch of earth near the cabin. It had once been Sarah's vegetable garden, a place of pride and abundance. For 5 years, it had been left to the weeds, a tangled, chaotic testament to his own neglect. Ilara knelt in the dirt, her plain dress protected by a burlap sack tied around her waist, and began to work, with a patient, methodical determination. She pulled the weeds one by one, her hands gentle but firm, She coaxed the stubborn, thorny invaders from the soil, clearing the ground to reveal the rich, dark earth beneath. She spent hours there, under the hot afternoon sun, her movements rhythmic and focused. It was the first time anyone had touched that patch of ground since Sarah's death. The sight of her there, tending the dead garden, stirred a long, dormant ache deep in Caleb's chest. It was a complex feeling, a painful mix of sorrow for what was lost and a strange, unbidden flicker of something else, something he refused to name. He turned away, his throat tight, and went back to his work, the rhythmic clang of his hammer against steel a counterpoint to the quiet, determined work of her hands. A week later, Caleb rode into Redemption Gulch for supplies. The town had been buzzing since the storm, and his arrival was like kicking an anthill. As he tied his horse to the hitching rail outside Gable's general store, he could feel the weight of their collective curiosity. "Mister." Gable measured out flour and beans, his movements precise, his questions anything but. "That was some storm the other night," he began, not looking at Caleb. "Heard a traveler got caught out your way." "That is right," Caleb said, his voice clipped. "A woman, I hear," Gable pressed, finally looking up, his eyes full of unsubtle inquiry. Caleb stared back, his expression a granite wall. "Her wagon broke an axle." His curtness did not deter them. As he was paying, Mrs. Gable emerged from the back room, a small, sharp-eyed woman with a mouth that was perpetually pursed in judgment. She gave him a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We have been so worried. It must be terribly lonely for you out on that ranch, all by yourself. Are you perhaps in need of a housekeeper?" The final word was laden with insinuation, thick and ugly. She was not offering help. She was passing a verdict. Caleb's hand tightened on his sack of flour. A cold, quiet anger rose in him. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers until she had the decency to look away. "I am managing just fine. Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice low and even. He turned and walked out of the store without another word. His silence was all the confirmation they needed. The story was already written, passed along in whispers over sewing circles and mugs of beer at the saloon. Caleb Blackwood, the grieving widower, had finally succumbed to his loneliness, and some opportunistic woman with a broken wagon and no morals had sunk her claws into him. By the time he rode out of town, he could feel their judgment following him like a cloud of flies. The threat was not confined to the town's gossip. A few days later, a new presence began to appear at the edges of the ranch. His name was Jed Stone, a brutish, arrogant hand from the neighboring property. He was a man who moved with a swagger, his belt slung low on his hips, a perpetual smirk on his face. He began to find excuses to ride along the creek that marked the boundary of Caleb's land, his timing always seeming to coincide with when Ilara was out hanging laundry or working in her resurrected garden. His gaze was a physical thing, lingering on her with a possessive, undressing quality that made her feel filthy. He was the embodiment of the vulgar, predatory masculinity she had fled. His presence was a constant, low-grade threat, a reminder that no matter how far she ran, the world was full of men like him. She learned to do her outside chores quickly, to keep her eyes down, and to stay close to the cabin. But she could always feel him watching. For weeks, their evening meals had been exercises in silence. They ate at the small wooden table in the cabin, the sounds of their forks scraping against the tin plates unnaturally loud in the quiet room. They were two planets in orbit around a shared, unspoken grief, close but never touching. Tonight was different. Ilara had made a stew, and the simple, savory meal seemed to fill the room with a small measure of domestic peace. The silence felt less heavy, less oppressive. She gathered her courage, a small, fluttering thing in her chest, and decided to break it. "Your brand," she said, her voice soft, tentative. "The one on the cattle, a rocking bee, what does it mean?" Caleb looked up, startled. He had grown so accustomed to her silence that the sound of her voice asking a direct question was jarring. He looked at her, at the genuine, simple curiosity in her eyes, and for the first time, he did not retreat behind his wall. To his own surprise, he answered, "My father's name was Benjamin. He was a dreamer. Always said he wanted a piece of land big enough that he could rock on his porch and see nothing but his own herd, the rocking bee, for Benjamin's dream." He spoke of his father, of clearing the land with his bare hands, of the back-breaking work and the simple pride of building something from nothing. And as he spoke, another name surfaced, naturally, without the usual agony. "Sarah. She designed the house," he said, the name hanging in the air between them for a moment. It was not a cry of pain, but a simple statement of fact, a shared acknowledgement of the ghost who still sat at their table. "She said a man could build a barn, but it took a woman to make a home." The dam of silence had been breached. A fragile, tentative connection had been made across the quiet table. Seeing his offering of the past, Elara felt compelled to offer a small, safe piece of her own. "My mother," she began, her eyes on her hands, folded in her lap. "She taught me the names of all the wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebells. She said you could never be truly lost if you knew the names of the things that grew around you." It was not much. A story about a brand, a memory of a garden, a lesson about wildflowers. But in the vast silence of their shared existence, it was a bridge, a fragile, trembling structure built of a few carefully chosen words, spanning the chasm between two deeply isolated souls. The fragile piece was shattered 2 days later. Elara was down by the creek, filling 2 heavy wooden buckets with water. The late afternoon sun was warm on her back, and the sound of the water flowing over the smooth stones was calming. She allowed herself a moment of unguarded peace, a brief respite from the constant vigilance she had maintained. It was a mistake. "That looks like heavy work for a pretty little thing like you." The voice, thick and oily, came from directly behind her. She gasped and spun around, sloshing water onto the muddy bank. Jed Stone stood there, leaning against a cottonwood, his arms crossed over his chest. He had dismounted his horse and approached on foot, as silent as a predator. The smirk on his face was wider, more confident now that they were alone. "I am fine," she said, her voice tight. She tried to move past him, to get back to the safety of the cabin. He stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Now hold on. No need to be shy. A woman gets lonely out here. A man does, too." He took a step closer, his eyes raking over her. "I could be good company." "Please let me pass," she said, her voice trembling. The familiar, sickening terror was rising in her throat, cold and choking. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Playing hard to get. I like that." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Come on now. Blackwood does not have to know. A little friendliness is all I am asking for." A scream built in her chest, but it was choked off by pure, paralyzing fear. This was it. It was happening again. The world narrowed to his leering face, the foul smell of sweat and tobacco on his breath, the painful pressure of his hand on her arm. Before the scream could find voice, a shadow fell over them. "Take your hand off her." The voice was quiet. It was not a shout, but it carried a lethal intensity that cut through the air like a razor. Jed Stone froze, his head snapping up. Caleb stood there, not 10 feet away. He had come from the cabin, his footsteps completely silent in the soft earth. He had been on the porch, watching, anticipating. He held no weapon, but his entire posture was a threat. Jed's bravado faltered. He looked from Caleb's cold, dark eyes to Elara's terrified face. He tried to bluster. "Now, see here, Blackwood, this ain't none of your business. Me and the lady were just talking." "I said," Caleb repeated, taking a slow step forward, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a deadly growl. "Take your hand off her." Caleb did not wait for a response. He closed the distance in 2 long strides and grabbed Jed's wrist. He did not punch him. He did not make a grand display. He simply applied pressure, his grip like a band of iron, and pulled Jed's hand away from Elara's arm as if he were removing a tick from a dog. Jed grunted in pain, his eyes widening in surprise and fear at the raw strength he had encountered. Caleb pushed him back a step, never releasing his gaze. His eyes promised a swift and brutal violence that Jed Stone immediately and completely understood. "You will get on your horse," Caleb said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You will ride off my land, and you will never set foot on it again. Do you understand me?" Jed, his face pale, could only nod, his arrogance utterly stripped away. He scrambled back, untied his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle, casting one last fearful, venomous look at them before spurring the animal into a gallop. The sound of hoofbeats faded, leaving only the gentle murmur of the creek and the pounding of Alara's heart. She stood there, shaking, her arm throbbing where Jed had grabbed her. She looked at Caleb, at this quiet, sorrowful man who had just stood between her and the abyss. He was not looking at her, but at the spot where Jed had disappeared, his body still coiled with a tightly controlled rage. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt something other than fear when she looked at him. She felt protected. He had not questioned her. He had not blamed her. He had simply, and without hesitation, defended her. In his quiet, unyielding presence, she saw not a threat, but a guardian. He finally turned to her, his expression softening slightly as he saw her pale, shaken face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice returning to its normal, rusty tone. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He bent down, picked up the 2 water buckets, and started walking back toward the cabin. "Come on," he said gently. "Let us go inside." That night, after their silent meal, Alara gathered her few meager belongings from the barn, her spare dress, her brush, the small pouch that no longer held a locket. She carried them into the cabin and, without a word, placed them in the small, unused spare room, a space that had served as little more than storage for years. Caleb watched her from his chair by the cold hearth. He said nothing. He did not need to. Her moving from the barn to the house was an acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance of a truth that had been growing between them. This was no longer a temporary arrangement. This was becoming something more. This was becoming a home. Jed Stone's humiliation festered into a poisonous lie. That very evening, nursing his bruised wrist and shattered pride in the Redemption Gulch saloon, he spun a tale for a willing audience. In his telling, he was the innocent party, a man making polite conversation who had been accosted. The woman, that quiet stray Caleb Blackwood had taken in, was no timid mouse but a cunning tease, luring a man in with shy glances only to have her keeper set upon him like a dog. She had led him on, played him for a fool, and Caleb, blinded by loneliness, was her witless protector. The story spread through the town like a prairie fire, consuming what little neutrality had existed and leaving behind the charred remains of open hostility. The townspeople's suspicion hardened into conviction. They had been right all along. She was exactly the sort of woman they had imagined, a manipulator, a temptress, a stain on the fabric of their decent community. Caleb was no longer just a grieving widower. He was a fool, a man so bewitched by a woman of low character that he had turned his back on his own kind. The change was palpable the next time Alara accompanied Caleb to town. Before, there had been whispers and stares. Now, there was a wall of solid, unforgiving silence. As they walked down the main street, conversations on porches stopped dead. Faces turned away. At the general store, Mr. Gable served them with a grim-faced efficiency, avoiding their eyes. His answers to Caleb's questions clipped to single syllables. When Alara reached for a bolt of cloth, another woman who had been browsing nearby physically recoiled, pulling her skirts in as if to avoid contamination, and moved to the other side of the store. The air was thick with a judgment so potent it was nearly a physical force. The ugliest moment came on Sunday. Caleb was not a church-going man, not since he had buried his family, but Alara, yearning for a sense of normalcy, had expressed a quiet wish to attend the service. They sat in a back pew, a pocket of isolation in the crowded room. Reverend Miller, a man with a booming voice and eyes that seemed to see sin in every shadow, took to the pulpit. His sermon was on the insidious nature of temptation, of the serpents that slither into good Christian homes disguised as things of beauty or need. He spoke of whited sepulchres, clean on the outside but full of corruption within. He never mentioned them by name, but every eye in that church slid toward the back pew, every word a stone cast directly at Alara. She sat with her head bowed, her hands clenched in her lap, feeling the heat of 100 self-righteous glares. The house of God had become a courtroom, and she had been tried and convicted without ever speaking a word. The constant, grinding pressure of the town's contempt began to wear away at Alara's fragile defenses. Their judgment was a relentless echo of the shame she had tried to outrun, a confirmation of the darkest whispers of her own heart. The self-loathing she had worked so hard to bury began to creep back, a noxious weed winding its way around her soul. She started to believe them. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a poison, a blight on this good man's life. She grew quieter, more withdrawn than ever. The small bridge of conversation they had built between them crumbled into disuse. She moved about the cabin like a phantom, her eyes shadowed and haunted. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares, vivid and suffocating, plagued her, leaving her to wake in the dark, her heart pounding, the cold sweat of old terrors slick on her skin. She would lie there, listening to the steady sound of Caleb's breathing from the other room, and feel a profound, aching guilt for bringing her tainted past into the quiet sanctuary of his grief. Caleb saw the light in her dimming, and it filled him with a cold, protective rage he had not felt in years. He saw the life draining from her eyes, the way she had begun to hold herself as if expecting a blow. It angered him in a way Jed Stone's physical threat never could. The town, with its petty gossip and pious cruelty, was doing more damage than a brute's hands ever could. They were crushing her spirit, and he felt a furious, helpless urge to stand between her and the entire world. A week later, a notice was posted outside the general store announcing a barn dance at the Miller farm. It was a rare social event for the scattered, isolated community, a chance to gather and forget the hardships of their lives for a single night. For Caleb, it became an idea, a defiant impulse. He would not let them be driven into hiding. He would not let their whispers and stares win. That evening, he found Alara sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the fading light as if it were the end of the world. He stood behind her for a long moment before speaking. "There is a dance," he said, his voice quiet, "at the Miller place, Saturday night." She did not turn around. "We would not be welcome." "I do not care about welcome," he said, his voice harder than he intended. He softened it. "I want to take you. I want for us to go." It was both a challenge to the town and a plea for a moment of normalcy, a chance to be just a man and a woman under a wide Wyoming sky, listening to fiddle music. She was silent for so long he thought she would refuse. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A sliver of hope, fragile and terrifying, pushed its way through the despair. Maybe they could show the town they were wrong. Maybe if people saw them together, they would see not a fool and a temptress, but two decent, lonely people finding solace in each other's company, for the occasion. She unstitched a length of blue ribbon from a worn-out bonnet and carefully sewed it onto the collar of her best dress, a small, hopeful splash of color against the faded gray. The dance was a disaster from the moment they arrived. The Miller barn was alive with light and music, the air filled with the scent of hay, sweat, and cheap perfume. Lanterns cast a warm, golden glow, and the sound of a lively fiddle tune spilled out into the night. But as Caleb and Alara stepped through the wide barn doors, a chill fell over the room. The music faltered for a beat. Laughter died in throats. A wall of cold shoulders and hostile glares met them, as solid and impenetrable as stone. They stood just inside the doorway, suddenly and completely isolated. People turned their backs. The conversations that resumed were in hushed, urgent tones, punctuated by sharp, sideways glances in their direction. No one spoke to them. No one offered a nod or a smile of greeting. They were pariahs, ghosts at the feast. Caleb's jaw was set like iron. He would not be defeated. He would not let them see her pain. He held out his hand to her. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the sea of hostility. "Dance with me." Her first instinct was to say no, to flee, but she looked up at his face and saw the raw defiance in his eyes, the stubborn refusal to be cowed. It was for her, she realized. He was enduring this for her. She placed her trembling hand in his large, calloused one and allowed him to lead her to the center of the floor. As they began to move to the rhythm of the music, a strange thing happened. The other couples on the floor, as if by some unspoken, collective signal, drifted away. They moved to the edges of the floor, leaving Caleb and Ilara to dance alone in a wide, empty circle of judgment. The whispers grew louder now, no longer hidden behind hands. She could hear them, cruel, cutting barbs that flew like poisoned darts. "Look at them, shameless. Ruined goods, that one is." Poor Caleb, he does not see what she is. Each word was a physical blow. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on Caleb's shoulder, trying to block out the sounds, trying to focus on the steady pressure of his hand on her back. But it was impossible. The humiliation was a hot, suffocating tide, rising around her, threatening to drown her. The final, killing blow came from Mrs. Gable. The fiddle music had just ended, and as Caleb was leading Ilara from the floor, the woman stepped directly into their path. Her face was a mask of righteous fury. She ignored Caleb completely, her sharp, pitiless eyes boring into Ilara. "You," she hissed, her voice low but carrying in the sudden quiet. "You are a disgrace. This was a good Christian town before you brought your filth here. You are poisoning the soul of a good, grieving man. Whatever hole you crawled out of, you should have stayed there." The world stopped. The air left Ilara's lungs in a silent rush. Mrs. Gable's words were the match to the fuse, the final confirmation of every terrible thing Ilara believed about herself. She was a blight, a poison, unwanted. She tore her hand from Caleb's and fled. She ran from the barn, from the hateful eyes and the vicious whispers, out into the cold, indifferent night. She did not know where she was going. She was just running from the crushing weight of her own shame. Caleb turned on Mrs. Gable, his eyes blazing with a fury so cold and pure it made the woman take an involuntary step back. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look on his face was enough to scorch her to the bone. Then he turned and went after Ilara. He found her by the creek, the same spot where he had defended her from Jed Stone. The moon was high and bright, casting the landscape in a stark, silvery light. She was on her knees in the mud by the water's edge, her body racked with silent, violent sobs. She was scrubbing at her arms, her hands raw and frantic, as if trying to wash away an invisible stain, a filth that was bone deep. Her psychological defenses, so carefully constructed over months of flight, had not just cracked, they had crumbled into dust. The trauma of her past, a past she had never spoken of, came rushing to the surface in a terrifying, unstoppable torrent. The memory of a man's hands on her, brutal and unwanted. The memory of the whispers that followed in her hometown, the accusing stares, the way friends and neighbors had crossed the street to avoid her. The final, devastating memory of her own family, her father's face cold and unforgiving, casting her out so the stain of her shame would not tarnish their good name. It all came back, not as a memory, but as a living thing, tearing her apart from the inside. She looked up as Caleb approached, and the face she turned to him was a mask of utter desolation. Her eyes were hollow, empty, bottomless pits of despair. The fight had gone out of her. The quiet resilience he had so admired was gone, replaced by a brokenness so profound it seemed nothing could ever mend it. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, ragged whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rushing water. It was the sound of a soul surrendering. "No one wants me." The words were not a complaint, they were a confession, the absolute fundamental truth of her existence. the deepest and most painful belief she held about herself. She was a thing to be used, to be judged, to be discarded, unwanted. Caleb's heart broke. It did not break with pity, but with a powerful, clarifying anger at the sheer, stupid, brutal injustice of the world. An anger at the men who broke things and the women who scorned the broken pieces. He looked at her, kneeling in the moonlight, trying to scrub away a shame that was never hers to carry. And he saw everything. He knelt in front of her, the cold mud soaking through the knees of his trousers. He reached out, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle, and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. He made her look at him, made her meet his eyes. His voice was low, gravelly, and filled with an unshakable conviction that cut through the fog of her pain like a beacon. Then every fool missed heaven tonight. The words were not just a comfort, they were a rebuttal, a reclamation, a fierce and total rejection of the world's verdict. In that moment, he saw all of her. He saw the pain, the shame, the fear, but he also saw the strength that had carried her this far, the quiet grace in her movements, the gentle reverence with which she had touched his wife's dress, the patient determination that had brought a dead garden back to life. He saw the heaven the fools had missed, and he chose it. He chose her. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, and she finally broke completely. Years of pent-up grief, shame, and terror poured out of her in a raw, keening wail. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his shirt, and wept until she had no tears left. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her everything would be all right. He just held her. He held her as she shook apart, his arms a silent, solid presence against the wreckage of her past, a living anchor in a sea of pain. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, he did not let her go. He kept his arms around her, there in the cold moonlight by the creek, and he began to speak. He shared with her the one piece of his own brokenness he had never shared with anyone. He told her about the last days of his wife and son. He spoke of the fever, the delirium, the terrible helplessness of watching the two people who were his entire world slip away from him. He confessed his deepest, most secret guilt, the belief that he had not done enough, that he should have been able to save them, that his strength had been useless against a force he could not see or fight. He laid his own soul bare, offering her his pain as a testament to hers, in that shared, raw vulnerability, under the cold Wyoming stars, their two isolated souls finally, truly connected. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were two survivors, two people who had been hollowed out by life, who had found in the other's wounds a reflection of their own. They had lost everything, but in the ruins, they had just found each other. The night by the creek changed everything. It was as if their shared confessions had been a great flood, washing away the years of silt and debris that had choked their souls. In the aftermath, something new and clear could finally flow between them. The emotional dam had broken, and in its place was a current of profound, terrifying intimacy. When Caleb led her back to the cabin, her steps unsteady, his arm a solid presence around her, the air inside the small wooden structure felt different. The unspoken barriers, the invisible walls of grief and fear, had dissolved in the moonlight. They began to truly share a life, not just a space. He would wake in the gray light of dawn to the soft sounds of her moving about the cabin, the gentle scrape of the poker as she stoked the embers in the hearth back to life. The smell of fresh coffee would greet him, a simple, domestic comfort he had not realized he missed so deeply. From the window, as she kneaded dough for their daily bread, she would watch him in the corral, his movements with the horses a silent, powerful language she was beginning to understand. He was a man who spoke best through his hands, through the steady, capable way he mended what was broken, be it a fence line or a fractured spirit. Their conversations, once stilted and confined to the practical necessities of the ranch, deepened. They moved from the weather and the price of cattle to the landscape of their own hearts. One evening, Sitting on the porch as the sky bled from orange to purple, he found himself talking about his hopes for the ranch, the dreams he had shared with his father of building a herd that was known throughout the territory. He spoke of fears, too, the fear of drought, of winter blizzards, of the crushing loneliness he had thought would be his only companion for the rest of his days. Their romance unfolded not in grand declarations, but in 1,000 small, tender gestures. It was a love story written in the margins of their quiet lives. One afternoon, he came back from riding the fence line and laid a small, tight cluster of wild purple asters on the kitchen table where she was shelling beans. He said nothing, just placed them there and went to wash the dust from his face and hands. Ilara looked at the humble bouquet, a splash of vibrant color against the worn wood, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the first gift she had received from anyone in years. She, in turn, sought ways to offer him comfort. In the chest where she had found Sarah's dress, she also discovered a small, leather-bound book filled with handwritten recipes. With a feeling of profound respect, she opened its pages. It felt like a conversation with the woman who came before her. She found a recipe for a beef and barley stew, with notes in the margin in a delicate, feminine script. Caleb's favorite, add extra time. She spent the afternoon carefully preparing it, following the instructions to the letter. When she served it to him that evening, he took one bite and froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his eyes full of a complex storm of emotions, surprise, sorrow, and a deep, aching gratitude. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick. "I found her recipe book," Ilara said softly. "I hope it is all right." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Her act was not an erasure of his past, but a respectful bridge to it. It gave him permission to remember without shattering. From that day on, he began to speak more of Sarah and Daniel. They ceased to be insurmountable ghosts of grief and became cherished memories he could finally share. He told her about the way Sarah's laughter used to fill the cabin, how she could make anything grow in her garden. He spoke of Daniel's fascination with grasshoppers, the way the little boy would follow him around the ranch, his small hand tucked securely in his father's large one. In sharing them with Ilara, he was not diminishing their memory, he was keeping it alive. Hearing him speak of his lost family gave Ilara the courage to reclaim a piece of her own past, not the part that had been stolen from her, but the life she had lived before the trauma. She told him about her love for reading, how she would save her pennies to buy second-hand books. She spoke of her bond with her younger brother, how they used to invent stories and explore the woods behind their Ohio home. She confessed the simple, girlish dreams she once held, of traveling to see the ocean, of having a small house with a big garden. As she spoke, she felt like she was reassembling the pieces of a person she had thought was lost forever. Caleb listened to it all, his quiet attention a balm on her old wounds. He was not just seeing the broken woman the world had made her. He was seeing the whole person she had always been. With this new, tender intimacy, a different kind of energy began to hum between them in the small cabin. A palpable desire grew in the spaces they shared, in the charged silence by the fire, in the accidental brush of their hands as they worked side by side. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. For Ilara, the thought of a man's touch was a minefield, tangled with the thorns of unwanted, violent contact. The idea of physical intimacy was a door she had bolted and barred, convinced she could never open it again. To feel the first stirrings of her own desire was a confusing, frightening miracle. It was a testament to the safety she felt with Caleb, a trust so profound it was beginning to heal wounds she thought were fatal. For Caleb, desire was laced with a different kind of barrier, guilt. For 5 years, his body had been as numb as his heart. To feel this stirring of life, this pull toward another woman, felt like a betrayal of the wife he had loved so completely. He would look at Ilara, at the gentle curve of her neck or the way the firelight caught in her hair, and a wave of longing would wash over him, followed immediately by a sharp, cutting sense of shame. One evening, after a long day of mending the roof of the barn, they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. A comfortable silence had fallen, but it was now charged with this new, unspoken tension. The air felt thick, heavy with everything they were not saying. Caleb looked at her hands resting in her lap, and he knew he could not live in this halfway world any longer. The risk of rejection was enormous, but the pain of this respectful distance was becoming unbearable. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached across the small space that separated their chairs and covered her hand with his. His touch was not demanding or possessive. It was a question, asked without words. His hand was large, warm, and calloused from a lifetime of hard work, and in its gentle weight, Alara felt not a threat, but a profound offering of tenderness. She did not pull away. The instinct was there, a ghost of a flinch, but she fought it down. This was Caleb. This was the man who had seen her at her most broken and called her heaven. She looked from their joined hands up to his face and saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear and the hope warring there. In that moment, she made a choice. She chose to trust, to step off the ledge of her fear and into the unknown. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his, and leaned into him, a silent answer of her own. Their first physical union was not a moment of explosive, desperate passion. It was a slow, reverent act of healing. He led her to his room, to the bed he had not shared in 5 years, and his every movement was infused with an infinite patience. He mapped the geography of her body not with lust, but with a kind of worshipful tenderness, as if he were trying to soothe every old wound, to erase every scar of memory with the gentle pressure of his lips and hands. He learned the places where she flinched and taught them there was no reason to fear. He held her and simply let her feel the safety of his arms, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. For Alara, it was a reclamation. She was rediscovering her own body, not as a source of shame or a site of trauma, but as a vessel for connection, for pleasure, for a profound and overwhelming acceptance. In the safety of Caleb's embrace, she found that intimacy could be a sanctuary. It was a desperate, beautiful collision of two people who had been starved of loving, wanted touch for far too long. In each other's arms, they did not just find solace, they found a shelter from the storm of the world, a quiet, sacred place where two broken halves could finally begin to feel whole. With their love now a quiet certainty, a deep and settled peace descended over the ranch. The silence that had once been a monument to Caleb's grief was now filled with something new. Ilara's laughter. It started as a small, breathy sound, but it grew until it was a clear, bright thing that echoed off the cabin walls. It was a sound Caleb had not heard in his house for 5 years, and it was more beautiful than any birdsong. Their days fell into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. He taught her how to ride a gentle, aging mare named Daisy, his hands steady on her waist as he helped her into the saddle. They rode out together, exploring the canyons and mesas of his land, a shared kingdom of stone and sky. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized, a silent dance of shared purpose. She would help him mend fences, handing him staples, and he would help her in the garden, his great strength turning the soil she could not. The ranch was no longer just his place of penance, it was becoming their home. The land itself seemed to soften. The sunsets, which he had long seen as just the closing of another empty day, now seemed more vibrant, painted in impossible hues of crimson and gold. They had created a fragile, beautiful bubble of happiness, an entire world contained within the borders of their fence line, a sanctuary built against the harshness of the outside world. The outside world, however, had not forgotten Alara. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The mail rider, a wiry young man who made a weekly circuit through the territory, left a single letter in the box at the end of their lane. It was addressed to her, in a crisp, unfamiliar hand. The postmark was from her former hometown in Ohio. A cold dread, immediate and sickening, washed over her as she held the envelope. Her hands began to tremble. Caleb, seeing the color drain from her face, came to stand beside her on the porch. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. With numb fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of heavy, expensive paper. It was not a personal letter. It was from a law office. The formal, legalistic language was cold and precise. It informed her that, upon the recent death of his father, a Mr. Marcus Thorne had inherited his family's considerable fortune, including vast holdings in shipping and manufacturing. He was now a man of immense power and influence in the state. Marcus Thorne. The name was a key, unlocking a black room in her mind she had kept sealed for years. The letter went on. It stated that Mr. Thorne had recently received information regarding her possible whereabouts. The final paragraph was a masterpiece of veiled threat, a velvet glove around an iron fist. It suggested that it would be in the best interest of all parties if she were to continue to live her life in quiet obscurity. It would be unfortunate if Mr. Thorne were forced to take steps to protect his family's good name from any lingering, unsubstantiated rumors from the past. The letter was a warning shot, a clear and unmistakable message. "I know where you are. Stay silent and forgotten, or I will destroy you." The fragile bubble of their happiness burst, and the cold, harsh air of the real world rushed in. Elara's old terror returned, a choking, suffocating wave, but this time, it was different. It was mingled with a fierce, terrifying new fear, the fear of losing this, of losing Caleb, of losing the home they had just begun to build. The life she had here was no longer just a hiding place. It was everything she held dear in the world, and this letter was a direct threat against it. She held the shaking piece of paper out to Caleb. He took it from her, his brow furrowed in concern. He read it once, then read it again, his expression hardening with each word until his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets, oblivious to the fact that their world had just ended. When he was done, he folded the letter with a slow, deliberate precision and looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was trying to hold herself together, and his rage coalesced into a single, unshakable purpose. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. He held her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. His voice was a low, solemn vow, a promise sworn on the very ground beneath their feet. "He will not touch you," he said, his words like stones. "He will not step foot on this land. I will not let him." Their idyllic sanctuary was no longer a home. It had just become a fortress, and they were now standing watch on its walls, waiting for the enemy to appear on the horizon. The letter was a poison. It seeped into the quiet peace of the ranch, turning the air sharp and metallic with the taste of fear. The peaceful, domestic rhythm they had found was replaced by the tense, jarring cadence of a watchtower drum. Happiness became a fragile thing, something to be guarded with a desperate, fearful vigilance. Every day that passed without a sign of Marcus Thorne was not a relief, but another turn of a torturous screw. Caleb's quiet grief was replaced by a grim, focused determination. In the evenings, he no longer sat on the porch to watch the sunset. He sat there cleaning his weapons. The rhythmic, oily click of him working the action on his rifle became a familiar sound. He would meticulously clean his pistol, his movements precise and deadly, his face a hard mask of concentration. Every morning, he rode the perimeter of his property, his eyes scanning the horizon not for stray cattle or signs of weather, but for the dust cloud of approaching riders. The land that had been his sanctuary was now a border he had to defend. For Elara, the world shrank. The vast, open spaces that had once felt liberating now seemed to expose her, leaving her with nowhere to hide. Every snapped twig, every distant cry of a hawk, every lone rider on the horizon sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. She found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, her body coiled in a perpetual state of readiness. The joy she had found in Caleb's arms was now shadowed by the terrifying possibility of its loss. The fear was a constant, bitter presence, tainting the taste of her food and haunting the edges of her sleep. Their love had made her strong, but it had also given her everything to lose. Marcus Thorne did not arrive like a storm, with thunder and fury. He arrived like a pestilence, quiet and smiling. He did not ride into Redemption Gulch on a dusty horse, but in a polished black carriage drawn by two perfectly matched bays, a conveyance so out of place it looked as though it had rolled in from another world. He himself was a vision of Eastern civility, dressed in a fine woolen suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was handsome, with a charming smile that seemed to touch everyone it landed on. He presented himself not as a villain, but as a savior. He stepped into the saloon and, with an air of generous bonhomie, bought a round of drinks for every man present. He introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, a family friend of the poor, troubled Albright girl who, he had heard, had found her way to this remote corner of the world. He spoke of Alara with a tone of deep, paternalistic concern, painting a picture of a sensitive young woman who had suffered a bout of hysteria after her mother's death and had fled her home in a state of confusion. On Sunday, he attended Reverend Miller's church service. He sat in the front pew, listened with rapt attention, and afterward made a donation to the church roof fund so generous it left the Reverend speechless. He sought out Mrs. Gable, complimenting her on the town's wholesome atmosphere and speaking with a convincing sadness of his tireless search for Alara, a duty he felt he owed to her dear, departed mother. He charmed them all. He was wealthy, he was handsome, he was pious, and he spoke their language of moral certainty. With the town's leaders firmly in his pocket, he began to masterfully twist the narrative he had established. In hushed, confidential tones, he elaborated on Alara's tragic story, her instability. He explained with a sorrowful sigh, had at times led her to display certain promiscuous tendencies. He, in his Christian duty as a family friend, had tried to guide her, to set her on a more righteous path. But she had mistaken his concern for something else, and in her flightiness, had not only run away but had stolen a sum of money from his family's estate. The town, already primed by their own prejudice, eagerly consumed his lies. It all made perfect sense. It confirmed everything they had already decided. She was not a victim. She was a cunning, fallen woman, and Caleb Blackwood, the poor, simple rancher, was not her protector. He was her mark. A lonely man being taken advantage of by a woman of dangerous and questionable morals. Marcus Thorne was not a threat. He was a gentleman, come to rescue one of their own from the clutches of a serpent. A few days later, Thorne rode out to the ranch. He was not alone. Two hard-faced men, the kind whose only trade was trouble, rode with him. They stopped at the edge of the property, a silent, menacing trio. Caleb met them at the fence line, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Alara stood on the porch, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The confrontation was not one of shouting or drawn guns. It was psychological, a slow, cruel tightening of a noose. Thorne dismounted, his smile as polished and insincere as his boots. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "A pleasure. I am Marcus Thorne. I believe you have something of mine." "She is not a thing," Caleb said, his voice a low growl, "and she is not yours." Thorne's smile did not falter. He turned his attention to Alara on the porch, his gaze traveling over her in a way that felt like a violation even at a distance. He spoke to her, his voice soft but carrying in the still air a menacing caress. "Alara, my dear, you have caused a great deal of worry. Your aunt has been beside herself. It is time to end this foolish game and come home." He then began to speak of her past, referencing small, intimate details that only he could know, the name of her childhood dog, a particular dress she had worn to a town social, the lullaby her mother used to sing. Each detail was a turn of the screw, a demonstration of his power, a reminder that he owned her history. When his words had no effect, he turned back to Caleb, his tone shifting from concern to business. "Look, I understand," he said, as if speaking to a simpleton. "She can be persuasive, but this has gone on long enough. I am a reasonable man. Name your price. I will pay you for your trouble, and you can release her to my care. He was treating her like livestock, a piece of property to be bartered. The insult was so profound it left Ilara breathless. Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle. "There is no price," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now get off my land." Thorn's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flash of cold, reptilian anger. He looked from Caleb's unyielding face to Ilara's defiant one. He remounted his horse, his movements stiff with fury. He looked directly at Ilara, his voice a chilling ultimatum. "You have a choice, my dear. You can come with me now, willingly, or you can stay, and I will take everything from this man. I will ruin him. I will break him and leave him with nothing but dust and regret. The choice is yours." With that, he and his men turned and rode away, leaving his threat hanging in the air like the smell of sulfur. Thorn was a man who kept his promises. Enraged by their defiance, he unleashed the full power of his wealth and influence. 2 days later, the county sheriff and a man from the land office rode out to the ranch. They delivered an official notice. A prior claim had been filed on the water rights to the creek that ran through Caleb's property. A claim backed by documents that were, on their face, impeccably legal. It was a lie, a fabrication bought and paid for, but it was a death sentence. Without that water, the ranch would wither and die in a single season. The next day, the sheriff returned, this time with a deputy. Marcus Thorne had filed a formal complaint, swearing under oath that Caleb Blackwood had threatened his life, brandishing a firearm. It was another lie. But in a town that now saw Thorne as a hero and Caleb as a fool, it was a lie they were eager to believe. They had a warrant for his arrest. Caleb did not resist. He knew it was useless. As the sheriff put him in handcuffs, he looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a desperate, urgent warning. "Bar the door," he said, his voice low. "Do not open it for anyone." She watched them lead him away, her mind numb with a disbelieving horror. It was all happening, just as Thorne had promised. He was taking everything from him. As the riders disappeared, leaving her utterly alone, a new feeling began to crystallize through her fear. The terror was still there, but beneath it, something else was hardening into a core of pure, unyielding steel. She was not the same frightened woman who had arrived in Redemption Gulch with a broken wagon. The love and respect Caleb had shown her, his unwavering belief in her worth, had forged something new inside her. She would not be a victim. She would not let Thorne win. She went inside and did as Caleb had told her. She barred the main door with the heavy wooden plank. She dragged a heavy chest of drawers in front of it. She closed the shutters over the windows and barred them too, plunging the cabin into a dim, fortress-like gloom. Then, her hands steady, she took Caleb's rifle down from the pegs over the fireplace. She checked the load, just as he had shown her how, and she waited. Night fell, thick and starless. The silence of the ranch was absolute, a holding of breath before a scream. She heard them long before she saw them, the faint, rhythmic drumming of approaching horses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands on the rifle were rock steady. She was no longer just afraid. She was furious. They did not bother with pretense. A loud bang echoed as one of Thorne's men kicked the door. "Open up, Ilara! Mister, Thorne is here to take you home." The voice was mocking, cruel. She remained silent, her back pressed against the wall, the rifle aimed at the door. Another kick, harder this time, making the thick wood groan, then a heavier thud as they began to use a log as a battering ram. The entire cabin shook with each impact. Thorne's voice cut through the chaos, smooth and chilling. "There is no point in this, my dear. Your rancher cannot help you now. It will be so much easier if you simply open the door." She would die first. Suddenly, a new sound, the crackle of fire. A hellish orange light began to flicker through the cracks in the shutters. They had set the cabin ablaze. Smoke, acrid and choking, began to seep into the room. The flames licked at the dry, weathered wood of the porch, their roar growing louder, more hungry. They had set fire to the barn as well. She could hear the terrified screams of the horses. In the flimsy Redemption Gulch jail, Caleb was a caged animal. He had paced the small cell for hours, his mind racing. He knew Thorne would not wait. He knew Alara was alone. His helplessness was a physical agony. He rattled the bars, shouting for the deputy, a young man named Peterson who had always seemed more decent than the rest. Peterson came, his face troubled. He had been there when Thorne had filed his complaint, and the story had not sat right with him. He had seen the look on Caleb's face, and it was not the look of a common bully. "You have to let me out," Caleb pleaded, his voice ragged. "He is going after her. I know he is." "I cannot do that, Blackwood. I would lose my badge." "Then you will have it to polish while a woman is murdered." Caleb shot back. He saw a flicker of doubt in the young man's eyes. "His story is a lie, and you know it. He bought this town. Are you for sale too?" The words hit their mark. Peterson looked away, his conscience at war with his duty. Just then, a faint orange glow appeared in the sky to the west. It was too bright to be the moon. It was the glow of a fire, a big one, right in the direction of Caleb's ranch. That was all it took. With a curse, Peterson unlocked the cell door. "Go," he said. "I will tell them you overpowered me." Caleb did not wait to thank him. He burst out of the jail, took the deputy's horse, and rode like a man possessed, his heart a cold knot of terror. He rode toward the pillar of smoke and the angry red glow that was devouring his world. He arrived to a scene from hell, his home, his barn. Everything he had built with his father was being consumed by a roaring inferno. In the chaotic, fire-lit darkness, he saw Thorne's men silhouetted against the flames. They were still trying to break down the cabin door. His world was under attack. A raw, guttural cry of pure rage tore from his throat. He spurred the horse forward, firing his pistol as he came. One of Thorne's men spun around, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of surprise. The night erupted into a brutal, chaotic gunfight. Caleb was a skilled fighter, driven by a desperate, primal fury, but he was outnumbered. He took cover behind a watering trough, the air around him filled with the whine of bullets and the roar of the fire. He fought his way toward the cabin, toward Alara. A searing pain exploded in his side, and he staggered, a hot, wet stickiness spreading across his shirt. He was shot. He gritted his teeth, ignored the pain, and kept moving. He had to get to her. Inside the burning cabin, the heat was unbearable. Smoke stung Alara's eyes and choked her lungs. The door finally gave way, splintering inward with a great crash. Marcus Thorne stood there, framed by the fire, his handsome face twisted into a triumphant, predatory snarl. He saw her, covered in soot, smoke stinging her eyes, the heavy rifle in her hands. He did not see a victim anymore. He saw the final object to be conquered, the last piece of his victory. "It is over," he said, taking a step into the room. As he lunged for her, the wounded Caleb stumbled through the doorway behind him, his face pale, his side soaked in blood. He raised his pistol, trying to intervene, to protect her even as his strength failed him. Thorne spun around, a look of pure, murderous rage on his face. He saw the wounded man he had left for dead. With a triumphant sneer, he turned his own pistol on Caleb, ready to deliver the final, killing shot. Time stopped. In that split second, with the roar of the fire in her ears and the image of Caleb about to be executed before her eyes, everything became clear. The fear was gone, burned away by the heat and a love so fierce it was a weapon in its own right. She was not the girl from Ohio anymore. She was a woman of the West, forged in hardship and fire, and she was defending her home. She raised the rifle Caleb had taught her to use, the one she had held in her steady hands all night. She pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, an explosive crack that echoed through the fiery night. Marcus Thorne's body jerked backward as if hit by an invisible fist. The look of surprise on his face was almost comical. He dropped his pistol, staggered a step, and then collapsed to the floor. Dead. The climax was not triumphant. It was horrifying. Ilara stood over the body of her tormentor, the rifle smoking in her hands, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the thick, choking smoke. Her home, her sanctuary, was burning to the ground around her, and the man she loved, the only good thing left in her world, was bleeding at her feet. Justice had been served, but its cost was devastating, absolute ruin. The world dissolved into a roaring, sensory blur of smoke, heat, and the coppery smell of blood. The triumphant crack of the rifle was immediately swallowed by the inferno's greedy roar. Ilara's mind, mercifully, went numb. There was no room for the horror of what she had done, no space for the grief of what she had lost. The fire was consuming everything: the cabin, the barn, the scent of lavender from a faded blue dress, the memory of a small wooden horse, every trace of the life they had so carefully, so tentatively built. The home that had been their sanctuary was now their funeral pyre. Her only focus, the only solid point in a world of chaos, was Caleb. He was slumped against the doorframe, his face a ghostly white in the flickering firelight, a dark stain spreading across his side. Primal instinct took over. She dropped the rifle, its barrel hot against her leg, and scrambled to his side. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her soot-stained dress, her movements frantic but sure. Her mind was a blank slate, but her hands knew what to do. She pressed the makeshift bandage against his wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, her own tears creating clean tracks through the grime on her face. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Caleb, stay with me." He was fading, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. With a strength born of pure desperation, she hooked her shoulder under his arm and began to drag him away from the oppressive heat, away from the burning cabin. It was a slow, agonizing process. He was a heavy man, and she was nearly spent, but she pulled and strained, her feet slipping in the muddy, blood-spattered dirt. She got him away from the house, toward the relative safety of the creek, collapsing with him on the damp earth just as the main roof beam of their home finally surrendered. It crashed down in a geyser of sparks and embers, a final, defiant punctuation mark on the end of their world. She held him, her body shielding his from the falling ash, and watched their life burn to the ground. Dawn broke gray and solemn, revealing a scene of utter devastation. Where a home and a barn had stood, there were now only smoldering skeletal ruins, black timbers reaching up like charred fingers into the pale sky. The air was thick with the foul, damp smell of a fire that has consumed everything and died. Ilara had not moved all night. She sat huddled by the water's edge, cradling Caleb's head in her lap. He was alive, but his breathing was shallow, and a dangerous heat was radiating from his skin. A single rider approached, the sound of his horse's hooves unnaturally loud in the funereal quiet. It was Deputy Peterson. He reined in his horse, his young face a mask of shock and pity as he took in the scene, the smoldering ranch, the body of Marcus Thorne lying twisted just inside the cabin's ruined threshold, and the two survivors, huddled together like the last people on earth. He was a pragmatic man, a man who understood the harsh arithmetic of power and influence in the West. He knew that Marcus Thorne had a powerful family back east, a family that would demand a certain kind of justice, a kind that had very little to do with the truth. They would not see a woman defending her home and her life. They would see a murderer. He dismounted and knelt beside them. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle, "you cannot stay here." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes vacant, uncomprehending. "His family will send men," the deputy explained, his voice low and urgent. "Marshals, Pinkertons, men who get paid to find people. They will not care what he did. They will only care that he is dead. You have to go, ride west, and do not ever look back." He pressed a small, heavy leather pouch into her hand. It was all the money he had in the world. He went to his horse, untied the lead rope to a second mount he had brought with him, a sturdy-looking gelding. "These are my own horses," he said. "They are fresh. They will carry you far." He looked at Caleb's pale face, at the dark stain on the bandage. "Get him to a doctor if you can, but do not trust anyone, do you understand? Trust no one." The deputy's stark warning finally pierced through Ilara's shock. He was giving them a chance, a slim, desperate chance to escape. With his help, she managed to get Caleb onto the gelding. He was barely conscious, slumping forward in the saddle, his survival resting entirely on her shoulders now. Their departure was somber and hurried. There was nothing left to pack, nothing to salvage from the ashes. Everything they owned was gone. Before they rode out, Ilara walked, her steps heavy, to the small rise under the lone oak tree. The fire had not reached this sacred place. The two small wooden markers were untouched. She knelt and laid her hand on the weathered wood of Sarah's grave, and then Daniel's. She could not speak. There were no words. But in the silence, she made a promise to the woman whose husband she now loved, a silent vow to care for him, to protect him, to get him to safety. It was the only prayer she had left. From his horse, Caleb watched her. His face was a mask of pain and profound loss, but as he looked at her, at this woman standing by his family's graves, his eyes were filled with an unwavering, unbreakable love. They had lost everything tangible, their home, their security, their past. But here, in the ruins, their bond was all that remained, and it was stronger than stone, more resilient than fire. Their journey was an ordeal, a descent into the purest form of survival. They traveled west, into the harsh, unforgiving Badlands. The landscape was a tortured canvas of cracked earth, twisted rock formations, and thorny, skeletal vegetation. It was a land scoured clean by wind and sun, a perfect reflection of their own state. They were fugitives, stripped of everything but each other. Caleb's wound festered. He drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in the bewildering, fever-soaked country between life and death. In his delirium, he would call out for Sarah, for Daniel, his voice full of a desperate, heartbreaking sorrow. Ilara, riding beside him, holding his reins, would answer him softly, her voice a steady, comforting presence in his nightmare. She was forced to become the protector, the provider, the navigator. The quiet, fearful woman who had once been afraid of her own shadow was gone, burned away in the fire. In her place was a woman of fierce, loving devotion. She learned to read the landscape, to find the hidden seeps of water that were the secret to life in this desert. She used the small pistol the deputy had pressed into her hands to hunt for rabbits and sage-grouse, the sharp crack of the gun a declaration of her will to live. At night, she would clean and dress his wound with boiled water and the last of her torn dress, her touch gentle, her focus absolute. She navigated by the stars, the same constellations that had looked down on her lonely journey to Redemption Gulch now serving as her guide away from it, toward an unknown future. During his brief, lucid moments, Caleb would watch her. He would see her, her face smudged with dirt, her hair matted, her body gaunt from lack of food, and his heart would fill with an awe so profound it eclipsed his own pain. He saw the incredible, unyielding strength in the woman the world had tried so hard to break. They had all been wrong about her, the town, her family, Marcus Thorne. They had seen weakness, a thing to be judged or used. They had never seen the steel that lay beneath. He had seen it, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever known. One night, huddled by a small, smoky fire in the shelter of a rocky canyon, his fever finally broke. The shaking stopped, and his eyes, when he opened them, were clear for the first time in days. He looked at Ilara, who was dozing fitfully, her head resting on her knees, the pistol never far from her hand. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She was awake in an instant. She gave him some water, her hands cool on his forehead. In the quiet darkness, with only the crackle of the fire and the vast, starry silence of the Badlands around them, they finally talked. "This is my fault," he said, his voice thick with a guilt that was as raw as his wound. "I brought this on you. If I had never found you—" "No," she countered, her voice fierce with a certainty that left no room for argument. "You did not bring destruction. Caleb, you brought me back to life. I was a ghost when I met you. I was already dead. You were the one who taught me how to live again." She looked into the fire, her voice dropping to a whisper. She confessed her deepest fear, not of the shooting itself, but of the strange, cold numbness she had felt in the moments afterward. "I felt nothing," she said. "I took a man's life, and I felt nothing. What does that make me?" He reached out, his hand weak but steady, and took hers. He held it tightly. "That does not make you a monster," he said, his voice gaining strength. "It makes you a survivor. What you did was not murder. It was justice. The only kind of justice this land understands. You saved me, Ilara." He squeezed her hand, his eyes holding hers in the firelight. He was absolving her of a guilt she did not even know she was carrying, just as she, with her quiet strength and unwavering love, had been slowly absolving him of his own grief. Weeks later, they emerged from the other side of the mountains. They were gaunt, scarred, their clothes little more than rags. They owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and the 2 weary horses beneath them. But they were alive, and they were together. They stopped at the crest of a ridge and looked down into a new, untouched valley in the Oregon Territory. It was vast, green, and imposing, a world of deep forests, lush meadows, and a river that snaked through it all like a silver ribbon. Their future was a blank page, as intimidating and as promising as the landscape that spread out before them. Caleb, still weak but healing, leaned over in his saddle and reached across the space between their horses. He took her hand, their fingers, calloused and chapped, intertwined, a perfect fit. He did not say, "I love you." He did not have to. The words were in his touch, in his gaze, in every shared hardship that had brought them to this place. He simply looked out at the valley, at their new beginning, and said the only word that mattered. "Together." She squeezed his hand, her heart full of a feeling that was more profound than simple happiness. It was hope, a deep, quiet, hard-won hope. She looked out at the horizon, at the endless green expanse, and for the first time, she saw not an ending, but a beginning. Their life would not be easy. They would have to build it from nothing, with their bare hands and their broken hearts, but they would build it together. 2 souls who had walked through the fire and had not been consumed, emerging, scarred and weary, but whole, on the other side. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts with us in English.